kick off recording. Um, if it's okay with everyone, I'm going to go through last night's code on both the front end and back end, and kind of just talk through everything that we did, right? Because while I do think that there's a lot of benefit of doing these projects and just going through the same steps of getting the practice, setting up the back end, remembering what to install, all of that kind of stuff. I also think that it's really important to not hit the end of the night and be like, I'm so exhausted, none of this information is really going to sink in at all, right? And so that's why I want to kick off tonight's class by reviewing what we did last night, just to make sure it is sinking in. This, for me, I think is one of the most valuable things that I can do as a teacher, because you may go, well, I have questions, but I'm questioning what the questions are about, right? This is an opportunity for you to say, all right, let me read that sentence, let me look at that line of code, and if there is any part of that line of code that I don't understand, or any part of the comment that I don't understand, or am I looking at the comment and the code and don't understand why I would use that, this is the best time to ask those questions, right? Because these comments aren't just for describing the code, they're hopefully a trigger for you to say, is this pass fail in terms of my understanding? Do I understand this or do I not? Right? And sometimes you can just look at that and go, I have a question about that. I've read the comment, I've read the code, and I still don't know what my question is. At that point, you just want to smash on the raise hand button and be like, don't get it, right? Because all it may take is me saying it a different way for that light bulb moment to go off in your head, right? So for tonight's class, especially, but in general, if you do have any questions here, this commenting exercise can be a really good time to bring those either questions or I just don't get it moments up, and feel free to dive into any of that. So I won't do live shares on this code just because we're only adding the comments on it. When I fire up the new section, obviously I will do that. Okay. Um, so I am also going to prefix all of these because um, in this code, we already have things numbered out here. Those numbers, though, are only for the front end flow. So I am going to go ahead and renumber all of these in terms of documenting the full stack flow. That doesn't mean that the front end flow numbers are incorrect. It just means that the comments were focused on full stack user interactions to get started with, right? And so the idea here is that when we're documenting this, this is more of the full stack user flow. And so I will start each one of these numbers with F in front of it for full stack. Okay. Any questions before we dive in? Was there anything from last night that was lingering around that we want to review before we number out all of last night's code? See, two people just joined. We're starting out just documenting last night's code, so no live share yet. And then we'll set up our day 3 folders in a moment and get going on the blog project and all of that good stuff. But just reviewing for the first half of class tonight. And everything that I number is going to start with the letter F, so it doesn't conflict with the numbers that are already in the front end. Okay, so we actually start back in our server. Why do we start in the server? Well, because the server is what is always running in the background, right? The server is likely on 24 hours a day. What happens is the server is waiting for requests to come in. Someone loads the front end, and the front end is going to be the one going to the back end to pull the data in, to go to the database, all of that stuff. So because the server is the backend server is usually the one that gets turned on first, we're going to start our numbering over there. So we are going to start up here at full stack number 1. And we say import express and CORS packages from npm. They need to be installed first. So we're not starting from scratch. We're not just writing vanilla JavaScript out of the gate. We're going to pull in these packages, just pre-built code that we can build right on top of. Then we come down and we say full stack number 2 is import db.js file from db folder. Now we got to pause there because when we import, JavaScript itself is actually going to pause all of this execution. It's going to go into db.js, do everything over in db.js, and then whatever that pops out, it's going to store right here. So we got to hop over to db.js. Good reminder, you can always command click. And when you command click, that's going to pop you over into that file. So we say full stack number 3 is import sequelize from npm. We haven't done anything with it yet. All we're doing is pulling it in so it's ready. Full stack number 4 is import message model from message.js in the same folder as db.js. The same folder is what the / is saying. The message.js is that model. Well, just like importing the DB file, we got to go look at message.js, make sure we understand that before we finish the rest of this file. So we are going to say F5, and this gets a little weird here. Import data types from sequelize. So we can define the types of the columns. Then we come down here, and because this is a function, so we don't run it yet, right? Just like a function, that function doesn't get called until we tell it, hey, go run this function, go define this in the database. Because we don't have access to the database yet, this function doesn't run yet. But what it does do is F7 export the function so it can be accessed in db.js. This is kind of a weird flow for Sequelize of getting this all set up. This flow is definitely simplified when we have everything all in one file, but it doesn't really make sense to me to have it all in one file because as your database grows, you're going to have a ton of different tables, and then that code becomes a lot harder to maintain. So while this flow is a little bit more complicated, it does do a better job of breaking your code out into separate files. So we're done here. We come back over here and we say full stack number 8 is going to be connect to, or I'm going to say specify the configuration to use Sequelize to connect to the DB. We actually haven't done the connection yet, but we've told it the host or the IP address of the database server. We've told it the port. We've told it what type of database to connect to because Sequelize supports more than just Postgres. And we've told it the name of the database. And that is a good thing. I'm going to say messages, the name of the DB must exist before we can connect to it. And then I'm going to say we happened to create it in Beekeeper. So we got to make that database before we can connect to it. Now it gets a little funky because we say F9, now give the model from F4 access to the DB. What it returns will be an accessible portal to the messages table. Okay, that's kind of funky. We go from here back up to here because this message model and this message model line up. So we take the database connection, we take that database and tell it, hey, the model needs the database. The model goes back up to the model here, which goes to the message here. So we take this DB and get access to it right here. Kind of weird. So we jump from this F9 to right in here, F10. We now have access to the DB from back here, F8. So tell the database to define a new model, which is essentially a table with 4 columns, and specify each of their data types. And I'm noticing there are messages in chat. Make sure those are yeah, Joe, I went back and forth of B for back end, and then I thought, well, but I'm also going to go into the front end and add some comments to them, and we haven't touched those yet. And then I realized F for front end and F for full stack, and here we are. Okay. Any questions so far? Kind of a weird flow. We're bouncing around a little bit here. This isn't the order that we wrote this code, but this is the order that JavaScript is executing this code, if that makes sense at all. Okay. So we've defined out the message. We return it. Because we return it here, we get access to the message here. This is the message that we need to do all of the queries from. So we don't actually query the message model. What we're actually going to use in all of our code is the model after it gets access to the database. Once it gets access to the database, then we can use that message instance, that kind of portal to go do things in the database with. But we don't do any of that yet. So we get access to the message here. We come down and we say F11, make an async function so we can use the await keyword. Then we F12 execute the async function from F11. Then we come in here and say F13, surround this in a try catch block so we can easily handle if the DB connection fails. Then we come in and we say F14, authenticate with the database. This is testing our connection from F8 to make sure it's working without assuming it is and running into problems when we go to execute our first query. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, our first query, select all the messages when the front end loads, may not happen for hours or days after we launch this, right? That first query, select all the messages, really only happens when the front end loads for the first time. Well, it is entirely possible that something has happened to our database server. We deploy the back end thinking everything is online, and no one loads the front end for a couple days. And when they do load the front end, they get some error and the API server crashes. Obviously not ideal. So by putting in this authenticate right here, what we are telling the database is not only go authenticate, but go test to make sure a query is working. Go make sure that you can send a query to the database and get a result. We are doing this right when the server starts. Because we're doing this when the server starts, we know right out of the gate we know right out of the gate, hey, we have to uh try the database connection, and if it fails, we can handle that right on startup, right? So think to last night's class, how many of you guys did I help out to go, all right, what's wrong here? Let's debug it. Let's make sure the database is created. Let's go do all of those steps. Imagine trying to have to do all of those steps only to find out that users are waiting for you to get that fixed. Much better to try that now before you go build an entire application and then realize there's a problem with the connection. So that's really why we put this in a try catch and why we have this authenticate here, to be able to catch a problem before it actually becomes a problem. Okay. F15, log this out only if there isn't a problem. And finally, F16, if there are models like from F9 that don't have a table yet in the database, go create those tables using the model structure. Joey, we'll get to your questions as soon as we're done with this file. So the .sync is basically saying, hey, go create these tables if they don't already exist. Now, I will note here that models are not live updating. They're not reactive. So if we go in here and add something or change a data type or add a new column, rename a column, this sync won't actually work. So there are a couple things that we can do to get that to work, and that will happen a lot in your capstone. You'll realize there's another column we need to add. There is something called a migration you can do, which is basically in your code, writing something out to alter the table structure. You can do something called force true inside of the sync. And what that will do is will delete out all of your tables, all of the data in the tables, and then rebuild the tables. Obviously, you want to be careful with that because you don't want to lose data that got saved in, but that is an option. And you can always go into Beekeeper, delete the table, or write the alter table command right in there. So this sync seems like magic, and it is magic until you have to update the columns, and then that gets a little trickier in there. So something to be aware of. Okay. Finally, we'll say F17, if there is an error, log these two out so we can debug. And then F18, export the model instances out so we can use them to interact with the DB in other files like server.js. Okay, try catch is, let me read the question out first. Is try catch async? I know it's an async function, but does that try catch on its own act asynchronously? No. So if you were to take this await out, this DB authenticate, because the authenticate method is asynchronous, it would throw an error in the promise itself. Because it throws the error in the promise, this try would not catch that error. However, when you put the await keyword in front of it, that then is listening for an error in the promise, and this try will catch the error because we are awaiting the authenticate. So the await is basically the conversion keyword to say, take either the result of the promise or take a thrown error from the promise and treat it as if it were an error thrown by a synchronous function or a return from a synchronous function.
So you can only use try catch in relation to a promise. I guess. Well, that does make sense.
No, because you can do something like try um I don't know, const ran number math dot random, and if the random is under 0.5, throw small random number, and then you could catch that error and go,
Oh, okay. So you can do it synchronously.
yes.
Okay, that was my question, among other
Hopefully
ones.
that example clears it up.
Yep.
Not going to leave that in there, but it is possible to throw errors just like it is possible to catch errors. Um, my One of my favorite things to do is when I'm like trying to debug and I know I've got a lot of error catching set up. I will come in here and just literally throw shit, and that will trigger the error. So just something you can do, because who doesn't love throwing shit sometimes? Um, Is there a list of sequelized functions and methods? Yes, there is, and it is quite long. So, love this question because any chance I have an opportunity to show you documentation, I absolutely love to. Like a lot of documentation, the documentation is split into two parts. There's the API reference, which gets a little bit in the weeds, but can be really helpful when you need to know everything that one function can do or the parameters that function can take. And then there is also like this getting started guide, which I like to call like it. Sometimes they call it a guide, sometimes they call it getting started, sometimes they call it like general documentation, but this is documentation, technical documentation usually falls into four separate parts. There's the API reference itself, which is like under the hood stuff, knowing everything that one tiny little thing can do. There is a tutorial section sometimes that is going to step by step walk you through the getting started, or some other more example like hands-on project. There is sometimes an example section which is saying this is finished code. We're not going to give you like a step by step through it, but it may be helpful in figuring out, how to use a couple things combined together. And then there is also a usually something that says getting started, and that's not like a project itself, but it's like, hey, this is getting it off the ground. So documentation is not consistent. This documentation looks nothing like the documentation that we've seen for React, other than those basic flows of understanding, hey, I typically learn from reading API references the best, or I typically learn from reading the like the overall guide. And that's what Sequelize does here, right? So Sequelize has a section for connecting to the database, and you can see something very similar to what we already used here, with connecting to Sequelize. You can see they use the authenticate method as well. And then we don't really have to worry about closing the connection. And then they give you a little rundown on promises. Over here, if you go into the model basics, you will see that the define is built out. And then everything that we've already done with data types, all of that stuff. I may not be using the same exact variable names that they do, only because the variable names that I use, I have found tend to be more explicit and easier to understand for students. But for the most part, they will be pretty similar. And then you can get into model querying basics, and see how you would create a new user, and then also the find all that we have already used. So the SQLized documentation I find to be pretty good. There is a competitor that I considered switching over, called Type ORM, that does tend to be very TypeScript heavy. which initially sounds good, but because we don't have TypeScript projects configured right out of the gate, I think that it's harder to wrap your head around what the ORM is doing when you kind of force everyone into using TypeScript in order to make your ORM work. It is technically possible to use type ORM without TypeScript and use it just in JavaScript, but it makes the documentation even harder to understand, and that's why I haven't used it or switched the class over to it yet. But it is always good to know what a competitor is. So type ORM is a very popular one. Sequelize is a very popular one. Different programming languages and full stack languages may have them built in. So Django is a very popular Python full stack web development framework. They have an ORM built in that I'm blanking on the name of off the top of my head. And then same goes for Ruby on Rails. They have a very powerful ORM. And then over on the Mongo database side, Mongoose is a very popular one in JavaScript. So just a couple names to throw out there, even if they go in one ear and out the other, at least they've been through your head at some point. So if you see them in a job description, you can go, oh, Mongoose is like Sequelize for a Mongo database. And then I will also leave you with the reason why I don't like the API references is because if you get in here and look at something like the model, they give you this like super long list of every possible thing that a model can do. And that is kind of interesting because if you go in here, you can be like, oh, I knew about find all. We use that to find all of the messages. I didn't know that there was a function called find by PK. So you can open that and then it gives you this entire like breakdown of the options. And then you can go into the breakdown from there. Oop, went too far. Um, get the details of that, and then you can see that they even break the options down even further for basically what the things are that can be in the option. So if this is your jam, this I find to be way overwhelming for me, and I will use API references as a last resort, right? When I'm in there and I'm like, this has got to be an option somewhere. It's not covered in the what I consider to be like the guide section or the more user friendly section. I much rather go in here and go into like model querying and go, oh, find by PK is here. I understand that's the primary key. I understand what they're trying to show me here. I'm good to go. That's how I prefer to learn. But if the API references work for you, there's a reason they make them, right? There are some people where like that just clicks for them. And if you're one of those people, run with it. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Pausing there for any questions on documentation. Yes, and Sequelize is great with their documentation on both sides, and that is both on the guide side and the API reference side. Um, I have found type ORM is less so, especially if you try to use it without TypeScript, and that is a major reason we have not switched over. So their documentation is great on both sides. Okay. And then last question from Joe is for sync, does it require migration even when restarting the application or only when the application is running and actively accessing the database? Um, so .sync executes a query that says create table if not exists, and then will dump in the table schema basically based off of what the model we have set is. If you update the model, it will not update the table in SQL for you. So it is entirely possible to add fields to your model, go look at it in Beekeeper, and not be able to see those fields because that table already exists. It will only run that create table if not exist query when your server restarts. But after the server restarts, the server could be running for days, weeks, months, years, and never rerun the sync until the server restarts. And when it does do the restart, chances are the table already exists, and so it will not sync on top of an existing table. And the main reason you don't want to do that is to like change your model and accidentally delete some data that's in your database that you didn't mean to do.
So does syncing it gets rid of the data that's in there currently? If it's
Only if you
being
do a
synced?
only if you do a forced true on it. By default, the sync will only sync your models to the database if the table does not exist. So
Gotcha. I see.
if the messages table here does not exist, it will create this table for you with those four data types. But if I add another column here and I'm like, oh, I need to keep track of whether this emoji has whether this message has emojis in it. I don't know. Dumb example. Um, I could add an emoji column here, but it will not add that column to my database. So I
Oh,
either
so
have to go into Beekeeper and issue an alter table command to add that column in, or I need to delete the table from Beekeeper, restart my API server, and then the sync will recreate the table for me.
which way is more common?
The alter table command, because you want to be very conscious of I'm going out of my way to update that table and then have my models match the database where the change has already been made. However, in development mode, it is very common to say, I don't care about any of the data in my database. I'm actively making changes to the model. And if I lose that data, say Levi, it's just dummy data anyway. At that point, it is very common to throw this force true in, which will basically wipe the table and then recreate them for you. But
Gotcha.
only in development mode. I would never expect to see a force true in a production server.
Okay. It seems to work exactly how I thought it was working.
Mhm. Yeah, it's only it's I don't love the word sync because sync implies that it's a two-way, right? It isn't really a two-way. All it's doing is saying if the table does not exist, this is what the table should look like.
Should be called initial sync.
Yeah, an initial sync or db.create initial tables or something like that. But we are where we are. And you can find more details about that. They probably have it in getting started. Oh, they don't. Model basics. Oh, and there is an alter true. This checks the current state of the table in the database, which has columns, and then performs the necessary changes in the table to make it match the model. That's awesome. I don't think they had that in earlier versions of SQLize. So it does look like in addition to force true, you can do alter true as well. See, you learn something new every day. That is
One more
in the model basics under core concepts.
one more time that checks the current state of the table in the database. Oh, okay. So you don't have to go back to the database as long as you add it into it'll go back and check what you're setting the columns as in the
Yep.
backend.
And I
Gotcha.
do
Cool.
think that this has the opportunity for data loss, right? So if you like accidentally rename the column, it would be like, oh, that column doesn't exist anymore, but here's this new column that exists.
Right.
Delete that column, which had all the data in it, and then go create a new column off of that.
Which would be harder to do in well, I mean, if you're using Beekeeper, which has
It would be
a
harder to
UI,
do because you would explicitly be using like the rename column
right?
compared to Sequelize, which would not realize that you were renaming a column and it would just delete the old one and create the new one.
Hope you don't got typos.
Yeah. And if anyone thinks that this is like a tangent. This is something that over half of you guys will run into on your capstones of I need to add a new column to the database, or I didn't think through, I have to store this additional form field or something like that. So knowing the ins and outs of the sync can be really beneficial. So while I love to go down Joe inspired rabbit holes, this is actually a legitimate one that you guys will run into.
PM.
And yes, paranoid is actually a very common thing to see in databases. Um, it is sometimes called paranoid. It is other times called soft delete, where basically you instead of deleting the row itself, you set a column called deleted or deleted at to true or to the time that it was deleted. And that way, if you ever need to recover the data, you can just set that deleted at back to null and the data magically reappears. So the idea of deleting things in the database is really can really cause paranoia for database engineers, because once it is deleted, there is no edit undo, there is no going to the trash can. If you delete a row, that row is deleted. So instead, what a lot of developers do and database engineers is they just mark that thing as deleted by setting the deleted column. And then when they write their select query, they basically add on a where that says where deleted is null or where deleted is false, which is a very common design pattern. And because it is so common, a lot of object relational mappers will have that functionality kind of built in as something you can turn on without having to manually build out. Rare W in devs naming things. Yeah. Okay, let's go back to finishing this out. So we have made it all the way through our database file. We have spent 45 minutes now just going through existing code. Why is that worth it? Well, because this is the first time that we're seeing Sequelize. This is the first time that we set all of this up. And there are things that we did where you're like, authenticate, yeah, that makes sense. But how is that working? Why do we need to do that? We put this all in a try catch. That seems like a good idea. But why do we need to do that? If we are learning this as a new standard way of doing this, we want to make sure that we understand that standard. So when we go use it in our capstone, when we go use it on all the other projects we're doing in the full stack world, we have that solid base of understanding. So I'm going to pause here. I'm only going to comment out the rest of the example query for finding and creating a message. I will comment that out on the front end as well so that we see where we call those endpoints. And then I will not go through every single step of how does the update work, how does the delete work, all of that stuff. I just want a base level understanding of those comments. But I am going to shut up here for a full 30 seconds, let you guys read through this file and see if you have any questions on this or anything over in the model. I'll create a live share, even though I said I wasn't going to, just because I know that that can be much easier to read when you can scroll through it yourselves. Okay, take a look, join the live share if you want, or just read the code on or the comments on my screen. Let me know if you have any questions.
Is this about as complicated on average as back end development gets, or does it get, where are we at right now in the descent to back end?
I would say about a 2 out of 10.
Oh
No, I'm
boy.
just kidding. Um, there is it's a really good question. Um, this is about as complicated as it gets for entry level full stack web development. So authentication is something we haven't covered that gets a little bit more complicated. Database is this is about as bad as it gets. We haven't covered making endpoints in multiple different files. So that gets a little bit more complicated, but if you understand the flow of how the message is getting imported and exported, you kind of understand moving routes in or endpoints into their own separate files and integrating those in. So I would say authentication, and there's some an idea called middleware. It's something we haven't covered and we will cover when Ryan comes in next week. Um, Moving routes out to their own file is a little bit more complicated, but that's like a half a point on the scale. But in terms of database connections and ORMs, I feel like that's probably the most complicated, and we have covered the vast majority of that. So for in terms of what we will cover in class, I would say for we are at a difficulty level of 4 out of 5 here. So everything outside of this is just going to be rinse and repeating, getting more practice with it and more practice on our front ends. So I don't think, even though this is only the first week of full stack, this is definitely the push you in the deep end and then make sure that you're treading water kind of thing. And then one-on-ones after this point become a let's hope you get this set up if you're struggling to do this on your own. If you're watching the class and you can't keep up and you're trying to do it for your capstone, that's what one-on-ones kind of become. So I would say you're at like a 3.5 out of 4 in terms of full stack difficulty, out of 5. um in terms of like real world, like what's the craziest backend thing that you have built, or what's the craziest backend thing that you have seen, there's a big gap between I can make a full stack web application that has a bunch of different forms on it to I can write a Google search algorithm that is technically running on a backend that indexes over a trillion websites and can return results in, 14 milliseconds kind of thing. Um, that is a obviously a level of full stack that I will never dream to aspire to, let alone think about getting better at my job to get to that level, right? So I think that there is usually a pretty big gap between the other. I guess the stepping stone to that is there's a job title called cloud architect, um, that is basically saying, hey, because this is such a big project, we're not going to just build it as we go. We're going to start analyzing this and saying, do we need to do SQL or Mongo for this? What kind of caching layer do we need for basically in-memory database results that return really quickly? Redis is a very popular one for that. Is this something that we're going to grow organically? Is this something that we're going to have 5 users when this thing starts, and we're going to grow it up to 1,000? And by the time we hit 1,000, our users are going to tell us what we need to improve on, or we're going to have information from our server logs about what's the slowest. Do we grow it that way, which is the way most software projects actually grow? Or are we Google, and when we launch this product, it's going to be available to 1% of our users, which is still a million freaking users. And so, because of that, there's a lot more that we have to do, in terms of testing and architecting to make sure that right out of the gate it works great. And so I would say that this is kind of as complicated as it gets, with the exception of maybe authentication. Um, in terms of full stack. You've reached that point where you've seen me code along and you followed me along. And at this point in the program, you're like, yeah, I can figure out what the parentheses are doing after the words authenticate. That's executing the function, right? Or I know enough about the JavaScript to figure out that the const is a new variable. Or, oh, this import export thing is a little new, but we were kind of already doing that in React. So I kind of get that over here. So full stack is the module that we dump you in the deep end the most, but it's also one where you get dumped in the deep end and hopefully go, oh, you know what? This isn't so bad because I know how to swim in the shallow end of JavaScript in the front end already. So it turns out, yeah, I'm in the deep end, but I'm not panicking as much as I thought I would. I don't know if that makes any sense at all to you guys.
No, that clicks for me. Couldn't tell where
Um,
I was in the education part of it.
yeah, yeah. Middleware is not hardware. Middleware is basically the request comes in. What are the steps that need to be done before we run your final function that's going to send the response back? So middleware, and Ryan will cover this much better next week, is basically saying for every request that comes in, analyze the headers to see if that user is signed in. And if they are signed in, extract out what their user ID is. So by the time it reaches the function that is running at your endpoint, you can access that data. The best example of middleware right now is actually server.js. This express.json is middleware. It is saying, hey, the request comes in, and before we create the message and send back something in the response, this express.json actually runs and says, hey, does this request have content type application JSON set in the headers? It does. So the rec.body gets filled with parse out JSON. This is pre-built middleware that is built into Express that is technically running right here. It's running between the request coming in and our actual function that runs at the end. And you can have multiple layers of middleware. We actually do. We're using cores and JSON. And you can have middleware that's global. You can have middleware that's set up on a router, which is a subset of routes in Express. And you can have middleware on each individual function that you are writing out. But middleware is basically just the idea of chaining functions together with request and res. It's kind of like promises promise chaining meets API endpoints. Not the best example of it, and that will Ryan will explain it much better next week. Okay, any other questions before we finish out the endpoint documentation and take a look at just one of the get calls on the front end? Okay, so we left off in DB.js. We finished at 18. We exported it. We are finally making our way all the way back here. This F2 is also import DB from DB folder. F18 is the last step. We are importing what we exported over there. Out of all of that work, all we've done is connect to the database. Now we got to set up our API server. All of that work was just getting the database set up. So we say F19, set up an Express server. That is, this Express is getting imported from up here. F20, tell the server that cores requests are allowed. F21, tell the server if JSON is sent in, parse it and store it in rec.body. Reminder, if you are trying to use rec.body like we do down here, and it says rec.body is undefined or cannot read null, cannot read new message text from undefined, that is because we do have to tell Express, hey, we are sending in JSON, please parse that out. And we come in and we say F22, set up a bunch of endpoints based off a URL and a method type. And then jump down to the end here and say F23 when the endpoints are done being created, tell the server to listen on port 3001. Don't ask me why I capitalized port there. There's a reason, but it's a rabbit hole. For any incoming requests from fetches on the front end. All right, now let's see how one of those flows works. We're gonna do that on right here. So I'm going to say F24, the user sends a message from the front end. F25, make a request using fetch to the backend endpoint / message. F26, make the type post. F27, specify the data body type as JSON. So Express knows to parse it. F28, stringify the data we're sending so it is actually JSON. F29, send the inputted message that's connected to the input via state. Also send the outgoing set to true and include the current time. This F29, really F25 through F29, lines up over here to F30. The request comes in from the front end. Technically, it passes through cores and express.json. And then it comes in here and says F31. Using the message model instance from all the way up here, from all the way through F2, create a row in the database using the data sent in from the body. Because the object names in the body match the column names in the model, Sequelize can build the insert into statement for us. And finally, F32, we always need to respond to a request. So send something back even if it's empty. Okay. Super boring, I know, but wrote a lot of code last night. I want to make sure that all of this code is really sinking in, right? So take a minute, read through these comments. I'm going to leave these on the screen because I didn't start a live share link for those. If you want to read through the backend comments, you do have the live share link for those. Check your read through anything on the back end, read through anything on the front end, see if you have any questions about this. I would much rather you have better understanding of this than be gung-ho about diving into the blog project and just getting more more practice setting all of that up, which we will be doing in a couple minutes, but I'm going to shut up, give you guys a couple minutes, see if you have any questions about this stuff. It would help if I was unmuted. Also open to any feedback or suggestions in terms of anything that you think that would help this click more. There was a diagram that showed something, or you can just tell me, nah, just shut up. This makes sense to me. I've been waiting for this for 18 weeks and we're finally there. This is my favorite module to teach because it's like it all comes together. You've learned 90% of what it takes to be a full stack developer. I really hate teaching intro to JavaScript because I'm like, I don't know, what do you want from me, man? It's not my fault there's so many parentheses and curly braces and they're all different. This stuff, I'm like, yeah, but now it's all connected. Like, see why you need the database, you see why SQL's in there, you see the data saving in, you see the data coming out. All right, we ready to dive into blog project setup? This is where it becomes a little bit more fun because we do have multiple pages that we're routing in between. We're pulling stuff down from the database. We're making it show up in state. The blog project is probably the most complicated project that we do. But the kind of nice thing about this is that you can go to this point in the video and follow these steps or do it for the chat front end, back end as well. You can follow these exact steps for your capstone and get SQLi set up, start creating your models, start creating your endpoints, all of that stuff. This does seem like a better logical breaking point. Do we want to go on break 25 minutes early and then come back and dive into that? Or do we want to just do 20 minutes to set up now? Let's do break first, right? Yeah. Okay. So go on break, be back at 7:05, and we will do the blog setup stuff and get going over there. Stop. Don't worry, I will not subject you to going through comments on the blog project unless requested, and even then we won't do that until tomorrow night. So we're over the worst of it. Now we just get more practice doing our setup.
we get more practice uh, creating a project from scratch. So if you are taking on your capstone this weekend, getting the back end set up for the first time, this will be the probably the best video to go through, or Monday night's video, either one, setting up all of the full stack art. Okay, let's go ahead and dive in. I am going to upload my code before I forget to GitHub, so all of those comments are in there. And then, okay, I'm gonna head into my week 18 folder. I'm going to make a new folder called day 3. In my day 3, I'm going to check the last time we did blog was in React. So
Not
I'm going to
sharing your
open,
screen.
thank you. I'm going to head into my code week 15, day 3. That was the last time we worked on blog. So week 15, day 3. I'm going to delete my node modules out of that. I'm going to copy my day 3 blog folder, and I'm going to go ahead and paste that into my day 3 folder in my week 18. I'm then going to rename that as blog front end. I will pop that open in VS Code and close out of my chat. Get the front end up and running first. So I'm going to right click, open an integrated terminal. I don't know why I suddenly have an output in my terminal. Did anyone else have an output just suddenly appear, or is it just me?
When you did
Nuts.
a live share, it did give us access to the terminal. I don't know if that has anything to do with it.
Yeah, I just don't know why I keep on getting this output showing up over here. I don't know how to close it other than to collapse it. Oh, did that do it? That did it. Yes. Okay, sorry. That's been driving me nuts for a while. Okay. In my blog front end, we haven't touched the back end yet. In the front end, I'm going to do my npm install there. And once that install is finished, I will do an npm start. And that will fire up my front end in the browser of where we left off, including 2 weird images that we will probably comment out. But I do have my blog front end up and running. For the back end, and then I will do live shares, I'm going to create a new folder called blog backend. I'm going to pop that folder, even though there's nothing in it, into my VS Code. And a couple things we got to get set up. First things first, because we are working with npm packages, I need to do my npm init-y. That generates out my package.json for me. I also need to do an npm install of express, cores, pg, and sequelize. The order of these does not matter, and you could do them in 4 separate commands if you wanted to. I did just paste that into the chat, and so we will go ahead and install those. I'm going to create a new file. You can call it index.js, you can call it server.js, you can call it my fancy express API.js. No spaces, please. But other than that, call it whatever you want. Server.js and index.js are the most common. Joe, I don't have the emoji in the Zoom Slack, but or in the Zoom chat, but we do in our work Slack have the crying blood emoji. And js.js is when I need to use that emoji. Although I don't think that it would actually cause any problems. .js probably would, but not JS. Okay. Once I have my index.js set up, I'm not even going to do anything in this yet. I'm going to go over to my package.json, and there are two things I need to add. I'm going to add my start command in my script section to npx nodemon index.js so that my node server will automatically restart for me when there are changes. And I'm also going to add in a type module. And that type module is what allows us to use the ES6 import style. That is, import from is the module system compared to the const name equals require with the parentheses. Nothing wrong with the common JS system. Everyone's just moving over to ES6 because it is built in natively to JavaScript. Once you've made it to this point, if you did not see in the chat, the attendance secret word tonight is comment. COMMENT. So go ahead and do attendance. And for any of you guys who are watching on YouTube, a reminder to still fill out the attendance form. There is now an option at the bottom of the form to just say that you were watching on YouTube. We have and for everyone else, we do have a couple students who have not just disappeared, but had work schedules change or that kind of stuff. So they are still following along on asynchronously on YouTube. Okay. Once you have all of that set up, we got to do our Express setup and our database setup, right? So I am going to try and do this completely from memory, and we will see. No, I'm not. I'm not at Gutsy. I'm going to pull up some reference code, but I am going to still do it by hand, just so hopefully the repetition makes it sink in a little bit more, helps it make it click. So we are going to create a folder called db.js. I'm sorry, just db for the folder. And inside the folder, we're going to create db.js. Make sure your db folder name has the file db.js inside of it. We don't want db.js just hanging out over on the end. And this is just organization. There's no like strict requirement that we have to put db.js inside a folder called db. You could call this db connect.js or connectdb.js or anything like that. But naming convention wise, this is what I usually use. From here, we can get started. So we're going to import Sequelize from Sequelize. I think it will work with the curly braces, but I want to use the default export from Sequelize, so I will do it without curly braces. We are going to say our DB is going to come from a new Sequelize that is going to connect to Postgres on our localhost 5432. It will connect to a project called Blog. From there, we are going to set up our connect to DB function so we get access to the await keyword by making it an async function, if I can spell async correctly. Inside that function, we are going to do a try and await our db.authenticate. If it can authenticate, we are going to log out connected to DB. We are also going to do our db.sync to create any tables. We haven't made any models yet, but we know that we will at some point, so let's get that fired up. We will console error out the error if there is one, and we will also error out db connection failed. Finally, we will call connect to DB and we will export our DB down here. And I will pause there and give you guys a second to code at breakneck speed. And as always, any questions you guys have as you're coding them or after you get done typing all of that in, of course, let me know. Nothing to test yet, just code. All right. Once we have that done, we've got to do some magic over in our server.js or our index.js, whatever you named it. Starting with a blank file, we are going to import Express from Express. Gonna import cores from cores. Express is the name of my favorite pizza place in my hometown, and every time I work with cores, I get hungry. We are going to import our DB from our db/db.js. Very easy to forget that we need the folder name here, which is why we have a slash. We have the opening slash because we're importing from our file, not from npm. We have another slash because our db file is inside the db folder. And then while React is oddly not picky about imports ending in .js, Node is much pickier about it. So I recommend ending your file extensions in .js for both of them. But in Node, it is certainly a requirement that you end it in .js if it is not coming in from an npm package. Okay, once we get our imports done, we can start using them. So we're going to say our server is going to come from Express. Because our server is going to accept cross-origin requests, it is going to use cores. We are also going to use express.json, so our rec.body gets filled in if the content type is set in the headers as application JSON. From here, we are going to server.get, just an empty slash with a rec.res. And we are going to res.send back API online. You'll notice that I have changed this up sometimes. It doesn't really matter what you're sending back. You just want some news that your server is up and running. Some services will actually do like a periodic check called a status check on your API server, and it will check it like every hour. And if something other than API online comes back or success true or whatever the health check is looking for, it will actually send you an alert that your API is down, your server is down and needs to be fixed. So it's always good to send something back at the root, even though we're not using this in our front end. It does help make sure we know that everything is up and running. Once we do that, we got to finish up our server setup with a server listen on 3001. Good reminder to close out of any terminals or VS Code windows that may be hogging 3001 because Express is not as good as React is at sharing or jumping to another port. So we will console log out here, API server online. Save that sucker? Joe question.
Yeah, were you gonna do a live share, or did I miss the link somewhere?
Yeah, I can do that.
Oh no, I
Backend.
think I shrunk my code.
Front end.
Is there a shortcut key for Zoom or something?
Command
To
0 or
Command
Command
0?
plus.
Oh, yes.
I've always like command plussed a bunch of times and minus times when I'm doing accessibility testing. And then someone told me, you can just hit command 0 and it will reset back to 100. And I was like mind blown. Before we actually fire up this code, does anyone want to take a guess as to what the error will be? The hint is that it's not in this file. And it is not a syntax error.
That it's not in this file.
It's not in index.js. It's triggered by index.js, but it's not in index.js. Yep, you got it, Austin. It's going to fail because we told it to connect to a blog database, but we haven't created that database yet. So just to show you what the error is, if we go to our terminal and run our npm run start, we get our DB connection failed. And if we scroll up, and I get that this is like a little overwhelming, error messages usually are, but in some part of that error message, I would say a good 80% of the time, there will be some part of it that's trying to help you out. In this case, it says database blog does not exist. So in order to fix that, we are going to go over to our beekeeper. Make sure your Postgres app is running in the background. Got an elephant chilling up at the top, you should be in pretty good shape. We come over to Beekeeper. I'm going to connect to local DB. It does not matter what database you are connected to up in the top left. We are going to create database. We're going to call it blog, and we're going to hit the run button. We get query 1 out of 1, no results, 0 rows affected. Kind of a weird message, but that's letting us know that everything is okay. However, like our front end doesn't know when we fix something in our back end doesn't know when we fix something in our database. So that's something to keep in mind is when you fix something in the database, you do have to manually restart your server. So I'm going to hit Control C in my terminal. That closes me out of anything that's open. If I was on a new line, it just brings me down to another new line, gets everything cleared out, stopped. I'm going to do my npm start over here, and I should get my connected to DB. Once I've got all of that up and running, I'm like, prove it. So I'm going to head to my browser. I'm going to go to localhost 3001, and I should have my API online. At this point, I expect at least one of you to need help because that was a lot of steps and we went very quick. And this is only the second API that we've created with Sequelize, third API overall, all in a week's time. So if you are stuck somewhere, I totally expect that at this point.
What's the expected output?
You can go to localhost 3001, and if you get API online in your browser, you are good to go. You won't get this API online if your database connection failed and you have the import in your index.js.
I do have that. Why is mine like white text on a white background?
You got to have a Chrome extension installed because I've got a Chrome extension installed called Chrome JSON Formatter.
The only thing I have on here is pretty dash print, and I can check it, and it just takes it out of the nope, just kidding, keeps it. Oh, it spreads out the object. So like how it would look in Postman or something. Am I the only one who's experiencing that?
I just dropped in the extension that I use for it, which is why I've got the raw and parse button up here. But I would check your extensions list and see. I mean, pretty print may be another alternative to a JSON formatter. Or it may be built into Chrome. I don't really know.
I've got React Dev Tools.
I don't think that will modify it. Okay, I mean, here, I can just, I disabled the JSON formatter. Yeah, that's what mine looks like without the extension. And then if you pretty print it, it just, yeah, it does the spacing. So I like it to do it by default, which is why I still have the extension on. Okay. Anyone need help? Anyone not get their API running? Anyone have errors in the terminal? Anyone get some weird database connection issue?
I could just use some help getting my database set up.
Yep. Go ahead, share screen. So only thing we need to do, you've already done on the database. So you've already created your blog. So if you give me remote, you've got your blog connection here. You've got everything right here, your index, you've got everything right here. So all we should have to do is fire it up.
Oh.
And it says missing script start. That is over in our package.json. You did get the type module. The only other thing we need to do here is tell it how to start. And we do that by saying npx nodemon index.js. And yes to install. And it is mad at line 6 of index.js. This is server.use.
Oh. All right.
Sometimes autocomplete gets weird. Okay, everything looks good there. So if we go here and refresh, your API is online and you're good to go.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Of course. Anyone else need help? Joe, believe it or not, Joe put it in the chat, I need more screens. There is a limit to the number of screens that like actually is beneficial. So I run, and I've got an older blog post that I need to update at some point. I run off two 28-inch 4K monitors. I really hated when I went up to 4K because I got one of them and I went, shit, now I have to get a second one of them because your max pixel density is basically the equivalent of 4K. It's just 4K on a 13-inch screen, which is basically 4K. It's just 2K because the screen's smaller. Anyway, so the only time I ever use my laptop at work, the laptop screen, is if I'm doing design work and I have like the mock-up off to one side, the live site that I'm working on one monitor, and then the front and back end code on the right hand side. That's how I typically lay out my monitors. But this module is obviously the breaking point and why we buy you guys external monitors, because it's like you are not only juggling everything that you have on the screen, you guys have almost twice as many windows as I do because you've got all of your own code on top of my live share reference code on top of Zoom. So totally get it. The good news is
it doesn't get any more complicated than this. We won't give you any more windows that you need to open. The bad news is once you're ruined with an external monitor, you'll never be able to work without one again. And so whenever I travel, I have a little 15-inch travel monitor that I bring with me, because it's just impossible for me to get any coding work done with only one monitor. And even teaching is hard to do on only one. So
I'm already at two. I got another 27-inch, and then I usually have my laptop on the laptop stand over here, but I can't connect Zoom so that it has so that I can share my screen.
Yep. The good news is once you get like your screen set up and your desk set up, and it took me years, right? And like slowly upgraded it over time. I haven't made any changes significantly to it in the past, I guess, 2 years. But I did upgrade my speakerphone, so I guess that is different. But it does take years to like get your desk set the way that you like it. And obviously budget is a big impact in that. Okay. We have our back end up and running. That's good. We've got our front end up and running. Now we got to think through, we don't have an ERD for this. And I'm not going to force you guys to design an ERD for this, but we do need to think about the data structure, right? Before we can put our blog posts in to our back end and even to our database, we need to think about what it's storing. Well, the good news is with reactitizing our front ends already, we are already working with data in state. So if you have built a section of your website that is already pulling data from state, oftentimes that is a good starting point for figuring out what your table structures will be. So I'm going to poke around in my front end. I'm going to go to maybe edit post in here. And in edit post, stringify, find post. Okay, maybe not an edit post. Let's go to new post instead. In new post, here we go. I've got my post object. I got title, content, author, and timestamp. Okay, interesting. Author is going to be the first thing that we do relationally in the database. We're going to have two tables here. We're going to have a users table and a post table. And we're going to keep track of who made what post relationally to the user. Probably not going to blow your mind with that tonight, though. What we are going to do is get those two tables created. So in the DB, I'm going to, in the DB folder, I'm going to create a new folder new file called post.js. I need to import my data types from Sequelize. Once I get my data types, I am going to say, hey, my post model is going to get access to the DB via a parameter. I'm then going to return the DB definition of a post by specifying that it will have an ID with a type of data types dot integer. It will be the primary key, which wasn't really important in that last project, but will become more important now that we are doing relational data. It will auto increment, so it will generate the ID for us. And then what else did we say we needed? Based off of the data over here, we need a title. And because my title won't be super long, I think it's fine to make it just a string by default, right? Say, hey, your title won't go over 255 characters. The content, on the other hand, will probably go over 255 characters. So go ahead and make that text. We will also, no, we'll leave that out. We'll just do title and content. Notice that I did not do in here the timestamp. Well, we're going to rely on the Sequelize function that automatically created the updated at and the created at columns for us by default. we could turn those off, but I think they'll actually be pretty useful. So we'll just leave that there. We do need to export the post model here, export the default post model here. Once we get our model set up, we need to tell our database about this model file. So I'm going to try and do a split screen here and try and keep this all on the screen as we go. In my db.js, I need to import my post model from my post file. I then need to say, hey, get the post by giving the post model access to the database. The only two new lines in db.js are import post model from post and const post equals post model db. Apparently, I cannot create a backend from scratch either. Export default post model, import post model. Ah, I forgot the .js on my import. There we go. So you should have the .js there. If you did your import and have an error about cannot find module, make sure you got that .js. I just got through 15 minutes earlier telling you that that .js extension is important. Can't remember it myself, apparently.
I think I'm having an issue with the live server. I don't know if it's just me though.
It looks like I got people connected. I would try the link again.
Am I not in there?
No, you were not.
That might be why.
Now you are. Okay. If all of this is working, your ultimate test is to go to Beekeeper Studio, which apparently I closed. Up in the top left, switch your database over to blog. If you do not see blog in the dropdown, don't forget to hit that little refresh button. And if we pop open our posts, we should see our ID, our title, and our content. We will add to that list of columns over time, but for now, that's a really good starting point. Does anyone not see their table structure in Beekeeper?
I do not.
Go ahead, share your screen.
All right. I don't know what's going on with this.
I don't trust your red squigglies anymore in your VS Code.
It was wrong. I was going off of your lines and didn't realize that I named the component with the lowercase p, so I just changed the component. So I might need to like just restart the
All I'm
terminal
going
in
to do
there.
is refresh here, and that brought up the public with your posts. So it is indeed just a VS Code issue.
What's the JetBrain equivalent for JS development?
WebStorm.
Okay, because I think VS Code hates me.
I think it does too. Tiffany, you're up.
I have same problem.
So make sure hover over the word entities in the sidebar. That brings up a little refresh button. If you click on that stupid hidden refresh button, that should show a table called or a folder called public, and then posts should be in there. If it's not, you can go ahead and share your screen. Okay, so let me request remote, and Austin, I'll come to you next. So the first thing I notice is over here, we should see a bunch of code about it creating the table, and we don't have that. So what we need to do is after we authenticate with the database, we call a function called sync. And now it did all of this create table stuff in SQL. And if we refresh, we get our posts and you're good to go.
Thanks.
That will also do it, Austin. Good work on debugging.
I fixed my squiggly.
I don't know if I need to call HR for that, but you know. All right, any questions? Everyone good? Anyone need a little boost to get them to the finish line? End result or end goal that we're going for is in our beekeeper. We see our post table. We may have to hit the little refresh button here, and we can see the columns that we've created over there. Okay. Now that we've got all of that done, what are we going to do? We need to set up the user model next. So I'm going to create a new file in my DB folder, also called user. And I am going to rinse and repeat a lot of the stuff from post. So I'm going to set my windows up as a split screen. And I still need to import data types from SQLize. I still need to get my user model, which gets access to the DB and will return a db.define of my user. I still need to export my default user. And then inside the define here, I'm getting lazy of typing ID out all the time. So I will add my ID in. I will add in, we'll say first name, which will be a data type of string. Last name, which will be a data type of string. And then we're going to do authentication through the database for the first time. This is slightly more secure than the local storage that we're doing authentication with, which is not secure at all. So this is a level up of security, but it still is not as secure as what Ryan will be teaching you guys next week. So we're going to kind of just stub this out in the database so that we can go back and add in security for it. But we're not going to, you know, fully flesh that out until after you learn Ryan's method. So I am going to, we will put in username here as data type string. And you know what? I actually am going to change my mind. I like using email instead of username because how many times have you gotten to a website and it asks for your username and you don't know if you use an actual username or your email address, right? So I prefer to do email instead of username. That's an option that you can choose as full stack developers. And then we'll also do your password, which I'm going to do as a data type .text to just future proof ourselves. I can't remember if the hashed password will be under 255 characters or not. So we're going to do it as a string or as a text just to play it safe. Nope, it's 72 characters. So we're going to change that to string. I'm being indecisive here. Sorry. All right, once we get our user created, I'm going to do one more model in the database. So I'm going to create a comment.js, and we're going to make it so people can place comments on our blog posts. This is a feature that is widely used in your capstones, and so we might as well get a little bit of practice of being able to place a comment onto a post for an authenticated user. So I'm going to, in my comment, import my data types from Sequelize. I'm going to say my comment model gets the DB from a parameter. I am going to return a DB define of my comment. Make sure you spell comment right. I am going to grab my ID from the other model. I am going to say my comment is going to have some text, which will be data type .text. My comment will also have an author ID, which will be a data type of integer. Curious. Could also call that user ID if you wanted to. It's another common naming convention. And we're going to export our default comment model at the bottom. Really love what I'm teaching and my dog is just snoring in the background. Really makes you feel energized. Okay, once we get all of those done, we do have to import them. We do have to give them access to the database. So in our db.js, we are going to import our comment model. Oops. And we're also going to import our user model. Order does not matter too much here. Once we get those models created, we are going to get our user from our user model and give it access to the database. And we're going to create our comment from our comment model and also give it access to the database there. If you are successful in all of these endeavors in Beekeeper, which I somehow keep closing, in the blog project, we should see all three tables we have created that should look like this. And you may notice this is a slightly different order. This order that we're going through is like get all the database stuff out of the way first. Once you got the database out of the way, then it becomes much easier, right? Because we've got everything set up, we can create the endpoints down the road, but this is thinking about database structure first, endpoint second, front end third. So this is a slightly different way about the order that we're creating these things, but also a totally valid way of doing it.
I got a question real quick.
Yep.
I had to in order to fix the linter issue that I was experiencing, I had to close out VS Code and reopen it. Now NodeMon keeps saying my app is crashing.
Probably a problem with your code or your models, but go ahead and share your screen.
Keep forgetting the monitor in front of me is monitor 2 and the monitor next to me is monitor 1.
Okay, it is crashing because it cannot find
Oh.
comment model, but that
Is it not?
isn't as obvious as you think. Comment, no, no.
They're
Comment,
not being exported in comment.
comment,
Nope.
you were correct. Good to go.
Cool.
Anyone else need help or another minute? Okay. So we've got our models created. That's cool. We've got our backend all fired up. And you know what? This terminal is just filled with SQL crap. And that can be really helpful, right? When we're learning SQL and we want to make sure that it's executing things. And there's some weird stuff in here like IX indis primary is primary, and we don't really care about that stuff. It's kind of annoying me, right? If there's an error, I want to be able to see the error in my terminal. I don't want it filled up with all of this SQL logging out. Well, we can actually configure that pretty quickly if we open in our db.js where we create our database connection. We can add in some additional options here, and one of which is logging false. And if we just add that logging false in as a second parameter as an option to our Sequelize, you will notice that when the Sequelize restarts, all of a sudden it's not logging out every single command that it has executed over in SQL land. So that can be very helpful to leave out when your SQL isn't working as expected. But I think it's more helpful to have that logging set to false just to clean up the terminal. Okay, now we can make our endpoints. So we are going to, I'm just looking at the homepage and I'm like, I got 2 posts here. I've got to be able to get those posts out of the database. In order to do that, I am going to make a server.get my messages, which is going to be an async reqres. Why async right off the bat? Because we know we're going to have to go to the database to get it. And this one I think is going to be pretty clean. We're going to just say res.send back all the messages. Where are we going to find the messages? We're going to find that from an await on our messages dot find all. Everything appears to be good to go. So if I come over here and I go to my localhost 3001 and I request my messages, we get this site can't be reached. And I'm like, what do you mean it can't be reached? You didn't tell me there weren't any messages. You just told me it can't be reached. Well, if I come over here, you will notice my entire app just crashed. And it tells me messages is not defined. Now, yours may not have done that. Yours may have worked because your auto import got thrown in here. But the point that I'm trying to make here is this is why it's important to test everything as we go. Even though Node knew that it couldn't find messages in my code in particular, it didn't tell me it was an error until I actually executed that endpoint. So none of the code in here is actually running until we hit the endpoint and ask it, hey, go find the messages in the database. In this case, it's pretty easy to fix. All I need to do is throw my messages up here at the top. I do that. Why are we looking for the messages endpoint? Because that's the first thing that we need to display on our homepage, on our front end, all the messages that are created. So
I now have a different error. It says import messages from db.js. It can't find that. Well, it turns out in my db.js, I did all of the work to give the models access to the database, but I didn't flow through the instances of that model. So I need to come down to the bottom and add in my post, my message, and my user to the export of db.js. Message, I'm sorry, post, user, and comment. Post, user, comment. Post, user, comment.
Does that change the
And
server.get then?
sorry, Joe, I just understood your question. I just totally brain farted, and you guys are just understanding the stink of it right now. This should not say messages. This should say posts. 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 My God, it's only Wednesday and I can't write any freaking code.
Your confidence stumped me. I was like, I'm pretty sure he's going off of the chat app, and then you're like, no, we're looking for messages. I'm like, oh, maybe I'm the problem.
Total brain fart there. Sorry, you gotta now go fix that everywhere. Post singular up here at the import. Post on the find all. Posts plural because we are getting multiple posts and sending back multiple posts. And then over in db.js, down at the bottom, we need to export post, comment, and user. I remember what project we're doing clearly. And if all of that is working, when you come over here and go to your posts, we now should have an empty array coming back in the browser. My brain worked real good at 8 p.m. on Wednesdays. Okay, sorry for that. One more clarification. On db.js, at the bottom, you should be exporting your post, your comment, your user, and no message. And then in index.js, we need to import post. Make sure your import is coming from db.js, not directly from the post.js file. Very common mistake to make. We need the post coming out of the database after the database basically has connected to it. So make sure you have post coming from db.js in your import, and then we can make our posts endpoint, which is going to the post instance from the database, finding all of them and returning them in our posts over here. Austin, in your browser, make sure you have /posts at the end of the URL. Your API is online, but my brain clearly is still not recovered from messages. And I screwed you all up there, so if anyone needs help, obviously, here to help trace you through. Everyone good? Anyone need a minute or help?
I think I need a minute.
Okay. Trickle down here one more time. The import of the models up at the top of db.js, the initialization of those models to get the instances of post, user, and comment also in db.js, the export down at the bottom here of the instances, so basically not the word model after them,
Then in index.js, making sure that you are importing the post from db.js, and then ultimately making the server.get for the posts plural, using the post singular model, returning to posts as the key in the backend.
I think I might need
Go for it.
assistance here. I don't know why it's complaining about this.
Do you have another export issue? Yes, you do.
Yeah, but it should be coming from post has been exported to here, which is being imported.
You're missing your export at the bottom.
No, I'm not.
Posts. Good to go. This is where we get into singular plural hell, and no one really agrees. Should you go to the post endpoint or the posts endpoint? Well, posts make sense if you're getting multiple back, but then what happens when you edit? Well, do we keep it as posts even though you're editing one, or do we call it post? There's no like one right answer for that. So just need to be basically consistent. Okay. Anyone need help? All right, give me 1 second. Okay. We've got all of that created. We've got our posts returning nothing on the front end yet, it's empty array, but we do have it connected to the database. Because we have it connected to the database, we can do finally some work on the front end. So in my app.js, I've got a router. Like, right, of course we have a router, right? Because we have multiple pages. So I'm going to go to my home component, and my home component has all of this nifty work for loading information. I'm like, huh, that's kind of cool. And I already have my posts in state. Isn't that nifty? And I even have my use effect in here that is pulling the data out from local storage. We don't want any of that local storage crap. We don't need that. We got a full-on database and an API we can connect to. So I am going to go ahead and clear all of my use effect out. And instead, I'm going to fill my use effect with my make API call, which is going to be async. We're going to make the API call right after we create that function. And we're going to write out our fetch code. We're going to say const res equals await our fetch to our local host 3001 to go get our posts. And the data is going to come from the res parsing the JSON. And then we are going to set our posts in state to our data.posts. Common convention here, before we make an API call, we are going to set loading to true. And then after we set the posts in state, we're going to set our loading back to false. That was the work that we did to make sure that we could display a message like loading ... or handle the fact what happens if the posts are empty. So if we save that and take a look in our browser back on our localhost 3000, we get this lovely no posts created yet. Like, huh, that's nifty. That's exactly the truth. I haven't created any posts in my database yet. So we'll fix that next, but for now, a good spot to be at.
What's the expected output?
No posts created yet in the browser. Make sure you're on 3000, not 3001. Everyone good? Anyone need a minute or help? Okay. Let's fix that. Let's go make a post. So I'm going to click on new post here, and that should take me to my title content author page. If you do not have the new post link here, you may need to log in. And if you need to log in, the super secret credentials are in login.js on your front end, and you should have a username and your password there. So if you have the new post link, you're good to go. If you don't have the new post link, you can log in based off of whatever is in login.js. We'll upgrade login.js down the road, but for now, we will have just a link. We'll just use what's already there. So I'm going to go to my new post page. And in my new post page, I have all of this nifty logic for creating a post. But again, using all that local storage crap that we don't really want to use. We want to save everything in the database instead. So I am going to clear out some of this. I'm going to clear out my old post as string and my let posts. I'm also going to clear out what's 24 in my code. If not old post is string, parsing, we don't need to do any of that crap. I do need to create my object called post. So I'm going to leave that as is. I am going to take out everything else except for my navigate. So this is what create post should look like when we are done cleaning it up. So our create post, the only thing that we have edited in the new post page, we're just clearing out local storage stuff. So we should have the event prevent default. The const form is event target, the const post, which is building our object for us, and then the navigate down at the end. Once we do all of that, before we navigate away back to the home page, I need to make that API call to send that data in. So my const, you know what? We don't even care about the response here. So I'm just going to do my await fetch to my localhost 3001. We are going to method post. Our headers are going to be content type of application JSON. Our body is going to be a stringified object of our post. Because we are using await, we have to modify our create post up at the top and make it async up here. Guys, a second on that.
Is that supposed to be posts again? Instead of messages?
Maybe he left in shame.
My fucking God. Thank you. Posts. There's something wrong with my brain tonight, apparently. Okay, create post. We threw our async up here. The URL here should be posts.
And then we are going to method post. At least that one I can remember is not method message. Application JSON, we've got our stringify here. Now, we are going to run into two problems here. First problem, we don't have a posts made. Over in our backend, we have a server.get for our posts. We do not have a server.post for our posts. So we are going to say server.post to our posts. This is matching the method. This is matching the URL or the endpoint. We are going to async recres here. We are going to res.send just anything back, nothing back, something back, so that we don't forget it. And then we are going to actually create it over here. So we're going to say await our post.create using the rec body. An annoying equal at the end of that I'm going to fix too. Okay, once we have that in, there's our first problem that we fixed. We do have a second problem that we're going to run into. I'm going to type in A, B, C. I'm going to hit create post. Oh, that actually worked a lot better than I thought it was going to. Okay, let's see what happened there. We see A got created. Our by is empty. We have a invalid date and then B shows up. Kind of interesting. Let's go look in our Beekeeper Studio. I'm going to pop open my post table and I have my title and my content in here. Okay, interesting. Our columns are called created at and updated at. Well, those are actually getting filled in by the database for us. If we look, I think, at the posts, well, let me see if I pop open the structure here. So in the post table down here at the bottom, I can click on this tab in Beekeeper and see the structure. And the created at and updated at are this weird data type called timestamp TZ. The TZ at the end stands for time zone, but timestamps by default in the database will automatically get filled with whatever the current value is, which is kind of cool. So if we go back in here, I don't need to send in the timestamp anymore because that is automatically getting generated by the database. So I'm going to take that out. The author, we don't really want to let the end user type in their author name, right? We want to tie that to whoever has created an account in the blog. So we don't want to let anyone type that in. We're going to tie that to user authentication probably tomorrow night. So instead, what we're going to do is take the author out of the post entirely because our database isn't saving it. And in fact, we're going to go down to the author down here and take out this entire div. Because again, we don't want to let the user, every time they create a post, set an author. So we're going to go ahead and take that out as well. Now, sorry, take out the div class name MB3 with the author field. And then up in my post, I am now only sending in the title and the content. So I've got A showing up, by isn't showing up correctly. Let's fix invalidate and then call it a night there. Because we've got some more work. The read more button now is completely broken. That's okay. We'll fix that. We're going to fix that with database IDs. You're going to see dynamic routing. I think you guys are going to get a lot of light bulb moments there. But no one wants to turn on a light bulb at 8:17 in their brain. So we're going to save that for tomorrow. We will fix this invalidate and then let's call it a night. Does anyone have any problems, though, up until this point with submitting the form or getting their post showing on the homepage? Or not seeing the data in Beekeeper? Okay, let's finish the date, call it a night. In my home.js, I'm going to come down here
and I'm going to find my date, which appears to be in post preview itself. So if I command click on the post preview, I see this new date. It's using post details.timestamp. But I don't know what's in post details. Fortunately, in my post preview, I do have a console log here for the post details. So if I pop that open in the console, I got this object chilling out here, and I can see the content and the title. Oh, nifty. There's a little ID in there. It's almost like we could use that for routing. But for now, we do have this created at and updated at. We can use either one of them. So in the new date to locale time string, I'm going to change my post details timestamp to my post details dot updated at. Updated at. And just like that, we now see the time that it was last updated. So the difference between those two columns, created at is obviously the time that that row got created. Updated at automatically updates whenever any of the values in that row get changed, which is kind of nifty. Okay, that is it. Our read more button is broken. We don't have our logout working yet, but we have started to take those steps to set up our database. We've got our API set up from scratch. We've got all of our database models set up from scratch. We confirmed everything is working in Beekeeper. That's awesome. We have integrated not only the create post, but the get posts endpoints into our front end. Still got a little more work to do on the read more button. Still got to build out some user authentication, but we're at a pretty good point to get our data flowing here. So I think this is a good stopping point for the evening. Anyone has questions? Happy to stick around for a couple minutes and answer them. Otherwise, have an awesome evening. If you did not get the attendance word, the secret word tonight was comment. Oh, come on. I know I put it in the chat.
Comment.
Comment. Okay, it was. You could also troll me and put in not messages, and I would also give you credit for that in attendance. I will not have a brain fart tomorrow, hopefully as big as that one, but otherwise, stick around for questions. Have a great evening.
And at least you were consistently wrong.
I'm still getting enveloped.
Okay, share screen.
I kind of have stuff placed.
It should be in that line that you updated. It's updated.
Oh.
Updated. There you go.
And then if I refresh, is it okay? It just makes one. I'm getting a warning. Each child in the list should have a unique key.
Yeah, we'll fix that tomorrow.
Okay.
I probably have the same warning, just didn't scroll up enough. Yes, I do. So we'll fix that tomorrow.
Sweet.
All right, last call for questions for the evening.
I do have one, but
yeah,
it's not about this stuff, so I don't know.
Yeah, shoot.
Okay, so going off of the conversation that we were having last night after class, let me just read. I sent it to you in Slack. Let me see. Okay. I think what my issue is wrapping my head around controlled versus uncontrolled components, and I guess the order in which things are rendering and being re-rendered. I guess I using the example like value equals new task. When we go to set something, like say we were using an input field for text, without using React, that's already updating and constantly aware of what the value is currently in the input. Why do we need to set?
So
why do we need to re-render it?
well, we need to re-render it because the browser is also re-rendering it every time that we type a letter into it. So by switching it from uncontrolled, which the browser is doing the rendering, to controlled, which is React is doing the re-rendering, we are basically moving that input into the virtual DOM. And that is making React control the re-renders instead of the DOM control the re-renders, the browser's native DOM.
Okay. So it's the exact same functionality as it was before. It's just we're taking control of it, handing it off to I see. Okay.
And
That's
so
the
that
part
is
that I was
why in the blog code, this is actually a really good example. In new post, we did not tie the text area for the content into state. What we did instead is we accessed the form and pulled out the value directly when the form was submitted. So we didn't actually use state in this. Well, why didn't we? Well, because all we're doing once this form is done getting submitted is we're taking them to an entirely separate different page. So React doesn't really need to control anything in this. It just needs to be able to pull the values out from it. However, if you were in the to-do list app and we typed in a new task and hit the add button, that is a controlled input because I wanted the ability to wipe out that text value and update that directly. So not everything needs to be a controlled input in React. But if you need to be able to control what shows up in that value in your React code, that's when you want to make it a controlled component.
okay. So the virtual DOM is the key aspect because I was just reading through like just an example code and it just seemed redundant to me.
Yeah,
but
I
I guess
think
that makes
people,
sense.
because state is kind of a hard concept to understand of like, well, why don't you just use a regular variable? The answer to that is, well, if you call the set function, it will trigger the re-render of the DOM. And people don't like to give that answer. They're like, state's this magical thing, and like JavaScript's bad at managing state, and so we made this entirely separate thing. And that's all kind of true, but like, what is state really? It's just saying calling set on it makes it re-render the parts of the DOM that matter. And so when you think about that, the example everyone gives is we'll link it to an input, and then when you call the set on the on change, it will trigger the re-render. That is all true, but then you get into people who are like, every input needs to be controlled. And I finally learned after years and years of writing React code, that's not the case. It is okay to pull those form values out. When it's not okay is when you have to start updating those inputs by using the actual browser DOM, not the virtual DOM. So it crosses the line for me of, well, if you're going to update the values of those form fields by doing anything other than the user typing in an input, you should make it a controlled input. But if you are just pulling the values out and then redirecting them to another page, which will clear the form anyway, I don't believe that every input needs to be controlled.
What about in the sense of and not doing an on change but an on submit?
Same thing. I don't think it needs to be if you're doing it on submit, I would still leave them as on uncontrolled.
Leave them as uncontrolled?
Correct.
Okay, so that was the part that I was like, why would I need to re-render it every time I type something if I'm only going to save it or set it once it's submitted?
The render's happening whether you're asking React to do the rendering or you're asking the browser to do the rendering, right? And the virtual DOM is much more efficient at doing rendering of selective components, but the browser is also very good at doing selective rendering on events
where the event is specifically on the one thing that it's re-rendering.
Right. Right. It matters. React matters more on the large scale, not necessarily on the small scale. Okay.
Correct.
So it seems like I had the right understanding of it, and because I'm like state is such an important thing to React. That's like its whole thing. So I should probably learn how that works and be
Yeah,
very familiar
and
with that.
Angular has it, Vue has it. The nice thing about Vue is that it doesn't require you to set it to update it, so that in Vue state is actually mutable. And Vue's argument is like, it's just data. We should be able to figure out what data changed and match that up to the DOM, which I kind of wish React did. I'm not a Vue expert by any means. And I was talking to my friend who is an engineer at Square and Block. And she was like, yeah, I would still be teaching people React because it has four or five times as many users based off of GitHub stars alone. And Vue is not a slouch, but it's still third compared to React, Angular, and then Vue. And then I doubt jQuery would be in the third spot if you slotted that in, but jQuery is kind of hard to assess because it's like, well, did you use one line of jQuery because you didn't know the document.get elements by class name got added to native JavaScript? Or, did you build an entire web app using jQuery, which is then putting it in the same league as React and Angular and Vue? So anyway, yes, you had the right frame of mind there. All of the React getting started guides I have ever read have state, if not the first thing, as the second, and the thing they always started out as tie it to input so that you understand the cycle of it. And I'm like, I personally think that's dumb. I want to teach you guys state by showing you data rendering in a map, and that when we call the set, the data just shows up. But it's really hard to do that when we're starting with a basic app. And I'm like, well, I have to know what you've typed into this input. So that's why so many people start with state and input, not state and rendering large data sets, which state is used for both.
Right. Yeah. Alrighty. Yeah, because I'm like capable of like using it and writing code with it. I'm just like, I'm not really sure why I'm writing this.
Yeah, the answer is because people oversell controlled components when people are teaching React.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool. Good to know I'm not crazy.
Not crazy, and there are benefits to controlled inputs. I just think people oversell the use of them.
Right. I thought it was a necessity to do it that way, that in order to pass something into say new task, like in order to call set new task, it had to be set in value equals.
No, if you leave now, you can't put a value equals on it and not the on change, because then you won't be able to type anything into it.
I can just not call the value equals though, right?
Correct. If you leave the value equals and the on change out, it will leave it as a browser controlled input, an uncontrolled input.
Right. Okay. Alrighty. I think my brain's all coded out for the night. Now time to go do my part 2 math final.
I will say I come off as a React expert, but I've never like peeled a layer back on understanding how React works. So I'm sure there is someone who is much more adept at the component lifecycle who would be horrified that I said uncontrolled inputs are fine to leave in React. But from my experience, I've had no problems and no performance issues with leaving them as uncontrolled.
Yeah, I don't know why my brain requires me to learn everything at such the lowest level of things.
After having, I don't know, probably 150 students, there's a good 20% of them who need, maybe 10% of them that need that low level understanding. So you are not completely alone in that. That is a pattern I have seen in students.
It's good in the end though when I get there, because then I have a more complete understanding. It just takes forever.
Yep. All right.
All right.
Have a good night, everyone. I will see you tomorrow.